Hello, friends, and welcome back to episode 7 of Scattered Thoughts. Happy holidays to everybody who celebrates them. We are planning to do 2 episodes in December, one on today's topic and another on the year in review for Magic the Gathering. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be your host for Scattered Thoughts today, and today we're tackling a big one. We're looking at the Commander ban list. So, my goal for today is to go over every single card on the Commander ban list and give my take on whether or not I think that card should remain banned, if it's a good ban, or if it could possibly come off the Commander ban list. I know this is me expressing my opinion on the internet, so I'm probably activating all the mercs out there who are going to immediately chastise me for my opinions, but I have reasons for all my opinions and I stick by them. I would love to hear people's opinions once we're done with this episode, and let me know if you agree or disagree. If you think there are any cards that I said should be banned that could come off the ban list, or if you think there's a card or two that I said could come off the ban list that you think absolutely needs to remain on the ban list until the end of time, please let me know. I'm going to break this down into small categories because a lot of cards on the Commander ban list are banned for different reasons, whether that's hyper efficiency or just not being a good fit for the multiplayer format. They weren't designed with multiplayer in mind. I am also going to give my take on a couple cards, just a handful of cards, I think 5 total, that I believe come up in conversation all the time that they should be banned, and I'm going to give my take on whether or not I think those cards should be banned or not, so stay tuned to the end for those cards. I should note, as always, that I am a fairly casual player. My decks are not optimized. I don't really play Commander to be optimized. I don't play CEDH. I respect it as its own separate format, but everything I'm talking about today, unless otherwise noted, is with an eye towards casual Commander, or at least just, typical Commander games. CEDH, I don't even know. I think at one point CEDH might have even had its own separate ban list. I don't know if that's true, or if that's still true, or if it was ever true, but we're looking at the ban list for Commander in general as dictated by Wizards of the Coast, and we are going to, I guess it's the CAG, right? The CAG determines what's banned and unbanned. Bannable, I should say, but at any rate, casual Commander. I don't really have much say in the CEDH community. So if these cards have a different appeal for you in CEDH and you are an active CEDH player, let me know, but just keep in mind that we're looking at casual Commander here. So to kick things off, our first category here is very small. It is the 2 dexterity cards on the ban list, specifically Chaos Orb and Falling Star. These 2 cards are banned not because they're super powerful. In fact, the effects of the cards aren't really even that good, but rather they require you to pick the physical card up and drop them onto the play-in field for some sort of effect, which is A, very chaotic, and B, not very inclusive. There are probably some Magic players who can't actually do that physically, so they would be barred from playing these cards. It also doesn't translate into digital Magic very well. I'm not sure how you would go about programming a Chaos Orb or a Fallen Star into something like Moto. Is Chaos Orb on Moto? Let me know, and let me know how it works, because I have no idea. At any rate, I don't believe normal games of Magic really should require any sort of dexterity involved in them. This is the same reason that a lot of the uncards are frowned upon, is because they require you to do these wacky things with the physical card themselves. They don't require any sort of strategic input from the player or anything like that. They're just kind of random and chaotic and goofy, and I'm fine with these cards remaining on the Commander ban list, because if somebody were to show up with them in their Commander deck, I can't imagine it would add very much to the game, especially since the effects of the cards are pretty anemic. One of the bigger categories here is the fast mana category. It's a really contentious point for Magic players because a lot of players really hate fast mana, and there are fast mana cards that are banned in Commander, but then there are fast mana cards that are arguably equal power, maybe slightly less power, that aren't banned, which we'll get to later on. But here, the biggest offenders are obviously Black Lotus and the Moxen, like Mox Ruby and Mox Sapphire. Not only do players really just not have the money to play with those cards, typically, unless they're proxying, which, perfectly fine, to each their own, but they do accelerate the game at a pace where the person who's playing them is just already super far ahead. Everybody knows the turn 1 Soul Ring, the dreaded turn 1 Soul Ring, can push you super far ahead to the point where you get basically unbeatable before players even get going, and Black Lotus plus the Moxen are able to do that. I do wonder sometimes if the Moxen are really even that big of an offender. Obviously, Black Lotus, the one-time 3 mana bump, lets you do some pretty gnarly things. We've seen the toned down version of that with Jeweled Lotus, which I think has been perfectly acceptable in the format, although very powerful as well. But the Moxen are really bad draws later in the game, and unless you're a deck that's hyper focused on finding them early and accelerate into some combo in the early turns of the game, the Moxen don't seem like they would actually be that good. If you drew one Moxen in your opening hand, it's going to be very similar to drawing a Soul Ring in your opening hand. I think the problem, of course, is that you can play the Moxen alongside other fast mana and just have these starts where you have 5 or 6 mana on turn 1. And then you can just, turbo out of control from there. So I am fine with Black Lotus and all 5 of the Moxen still being banned. I know some people have made the argument before that the white one, the white Mox, should be unbanned because white is so far behind, but that's not even true. Check out a previous episode of Scattered Thoughts where I talked about white being good in Commander again, but not the place for that conversation here. Next up is a pretty obvious ban. Channel is green for a sorcery. Until the end of your turn, you can pay life to produce colorless mana. I think this one goes without saying that it should remain banned. It just lets you turbo out everything you want as early as you want in the game, as early as turn 2 or turn 1 if you have an extra green mana floating around. You can get the Eldrazi Titans out on board on turn 2. You could get Blightsteel Colossus on board on turn 2 without any additional mana investment. You're basically just using this as a gigantic ritual effect, and you will lose a bunch of life to do it, but you'll be so far ahead that your opponents just can't keep up. So Channel, 2 thumbs up, keep on the ban list, please. Fast Bond is up next. This is a green mana for an enchantment. It says you may play any number of lands on each of your turns, and whenever you play a land, if it wasn't the first land you played this turn, it deals 1 damage to you. So obviously this is another one where you can turbo out lands super early. On turn 1, you could play Fast Bond and then follow up with every other land in your hand. So it's an easy way to dump all of the lands in your opening hand on the battlefield. And then if you have wheel effects or draw 7s or anything like that, you get to continuously keep putting those lands on the battlefield. Even in the late game, if you have one of the cards that lets you play a land off the top of your library, like Courser of Krufix, for example, you get to just keep turboing those lands out. The downside on Fast Bond isn't real enough, the 1 damage per extra land, to justify how fast this accelerates you on turn 1, maybe even turn 2. You can easily get something like 5 lands in play, cast a wheel, recharge, deploy a bunch more lands before your opponents have even played their first land drop, and that's basically just unacceptable for Commander. Speaking of unacceptable, we have Raphellos Llanowar Emissary, another just easy keep it banned card. Green for a 2/1 legendary elf druid. It taps to add green to your mana pool for each forest you control. So easily taps for just a ton of extra mana, and could be your commander, which is equally offensive, right? You could just always have access to this huge mana dork on turn 2, and then just accelerate way far out of control as early as turn 3. If you think about the gameplay pattern where you play a forest on turn 1, let's just assume you don't even play like an Elvish Mystic, which you would be playing in this sort of deck. You play forest on turn 1, you untap. On turn 2, you play another forest and you cast Raphellos. On turn 3, you untap and play a forest. You have your 3 lands for turn, and Raphellos taps for 3 mana by itself. So you're already at 6 mana for having just cast Raphellos on turn 2 and having a mana base that's geared towards forests. There are certainly cards that can tap for just as much mana as Raphellos, but they don't do it as early and as easily as Raphellos does. The card that comes to mind is Selvala, the mono green Selvala, which you can pay a mana and tap it to add mana equal to the highest power among creatures you control. It's not unheard of for Selvala to tap for, 10 plus mana with a single mana activation, but assuming everything's kind of just going 1 land at a time, that doesn't really happen until turn 4. At the earliest, plus you need other big creatures on board. Raphellos doesn't really ask that you do anything other than put forests in your deck, which you have to do anyway to have this card in your deck, so it's just a little bit too mana rampy for the cost. I don't even know how you would go about fixing the card. Maybe if Raphellos cost green, it would be less offensive, because then it'd be on par with something like the Llanowar tribe, the 3 mana 3/3 that taps for 3 green mana. Still, that would be pretty strong, though, because it would still scale as you get more forests in play. So, Raphellos, sorry, buddy, you've got to stay on the ban list. The last card I'm putting in the fast mana category is Tolarian Academy. Once again, easy, keep it on the ban list. A lot of cards on the ban list are going to be, unobjectionably strong enough that everybody agrees they should be on the ban list. I don't see too many people clamoring for Tolarian Academy to come off the ban list. It's just too efficient at producing mana. The thing that makes people scratch their heads sometimes is that Tolarian Academy is banned, but Gaia's Cradle and Serra's Sanctum are not banned. And I think that's pretty obvious when you think about it. It's just a lot easier to dump a bunch of artifacts onto the battlefield earlier than it is to dump a bunch of creatures or enchantments. Obviously, Serra's Sanctum isn't even close to the other two, and Gaia's Cradle is pushing the power level of Tolarian Academy, but Academy is just so much easier to enable. You just don't really see that because the card is banned, so people don't actually play it. But look up any vintage deck where the user is playing Tolarian Academy, and you can see how much mana this card can produce and how easily it does it early on in the game. Our format is one where people are incentivized to play a bunch of early mana rocks. You can power this up with artifact lands like Seed of the Synod and such. It's just very easy to have this tap for 5, 6, 7 mana as early as like turn 2 or 3, and a land that does that is just a little bit too unacceptable. Gaia's Cradle at least takes a little bit of a nut draw or a little bit of time to get going, but it does have an equal power level when it comes later in the game. Tolarian Academy is just a little bit too consistent at doing that earlier in the game. So let's transition from the fast mana category to the card draw category, basically cards that give you an insurmountable amount of card advantage or give you card draw at a rate that's just too efficient, with the obvious headliner being the power card Ancestral Recall. A single blue mana for an instant, target player draws 3 cards. Just as efficient as card draw is ever going to get. There are certainly cards that can rival this, like Visions from Beyond and stuff like that. But for the most part, you are paying a mana for 3 cards, and that's just a completely unacceptable rate. Just very funny to see these designs on old Magic cards and, you know, how broken some of these things were. But Ancestral Recall just unfortunately has no downside to it, so I believe card advantage and mana rule Commander, so this amount of card advantage at this cost is just unreasonable. The next one on this list is a card that I would be curious to hear other people's opinions on. It's Library of Alexandria. It is a land that taps for colorless mana, or you can tap it to draw a card, but you can only activate that ability if you have exactly 7 cards in hand. Not 7 or more, but exactly 7. This is a bit of a mirror breaker card in Vintage from what I've seen. It's really easy to outcard your opponent when you're just up an extra card every single turn. You do have to do a little bit of work to maintain having 7 cards in hand, but that's not super hard to pull off. It's also very, very expensive in paper, but I wonder if this would really break anything in the EDH format, especially since you have to kind of not deploy cards in order to keep activating this, and it's only 1 extra card per turn. You're basically giving up a land to be able to activate this because you can't tap it for mana and tap it to draw a card. I actually think if this card was a little bit more accessible, that it would be pretty safe to unban in Commander. And again, this is where my CEDH red flags start flaring up, because I don't know how strong this card would be in CEDH. But the way I play Magic, I don't really play 1v1. I'm actually quite opposed to playing 1v1. And I can't imagine in a 4-person game being down a land, having to maintain an exact 7-card hand, never drawing more than 7 if you have like a Reliquary Tower, never being below 7. I think all of these things, just to be able to draw an extra card each turn, is something that wouldn't break the game, especially since you can just deploy a lot of cards that draw you extra cards anyway. The argument against that is that it's pretty free to put in your deck, since it is just a land that taps for mana anyway. It's not like a Maze of Ith that can't tap for mana. You know, you're basically using it as a spell slot instead of a land slot. You don't really have to give up a land drop to use this, and you can just activate it whenever. So it's fairly safe, but I don't think it would break anything anyway, at least not for multiplayer games. In 1v1, I could see how Library of Alexandria might be a problem, but for casual multiplayer games, I think Library could be unbanned. I think that would be pretty safe. This might damage other formats, though, like CEDH and stuff like that. So if that's the case, then remain banned. You know, people can't really get their hands on this card anyway. It's like almost $2,000. But yeah, I think in casual Commander, this card would be pretty good and pretty strong if it was more accessible, but I don't think it would break the format. I do think Yawgmoth's Bargain might break the format if it was unbanned. Yawgmoth's Bargain is 4 black for an enchantment that makes you skip your draw step, but it has an activated ability where you can pay a life to draw a card. So basically, once it's on the battlefield, you don't get to draw during your draw step anymore, but you get to turn as much life as you want into extra cards. It's got a very similar effect to Necropotence, but without as much downside, and you get your cards immediately, so it's really easy to kind of just storm off if you're looking for a specific combo piece and you can land this. You can find those combo pieces. You can put a lot of free mana in your deck to kind of facilitate casting those cards. I've played with this card in Vintage Cube before, and it's a little clunky there, but it is a little bit of a storm enabler. You know, if you drop this and you're at 14 life, you basically have 13 extra cards in your hand if you need them. And in Commander, where your life total's 40 and it's, you know, really easy to gain a ton of extra life, you can basically just rattle off at least like half of your deck if you needed to. And if you're a combo deck, you can turn that into a win. So it's a little bit gimmicky to get out on board. It's 6 mana for an enchantment. It does have a little bit of a downside. If you tap out for it, you might not be able to do anything else the turn you play it. But if you have any amount of mana left over, you should be able to convert this into a win. And I understand why this card is banned. It's one of the ones that I'm a little skeptical on, but I think on the safe side, this card can't really do any good. Necropotence already kind of does what you want this card to do, and that card's not banned, so you could just play Necropotence instead. You're not really missing out on this sort of effect. I think it's safe to keep Yawgmoth's Bargain banned. Gifts Ungiven is the last card draw card that I'm going to talk about on the ban list. It's 3 and a blue for an instant. Search your library for up to 4 cards with different names and reveal them. Target opponent chooses 2 of them. You put the chosen cards into your graveyard and the rest in your hand and shuffle. So basically you get to tutor up 4 cards. The different name part doesn't matter as much. Your opponent chooses which 2 you get and the other 2 go to the graveyard. Obviously, if you've played with this card in Constructed before, you know there's a little bit of trickiness you can do where you only fetch up 2 cards and your opponent has to put those 2 cards in the graveyard. But this is just a double tutor for 4 mana at instant speed. That's often going to give you more than 2 cards worth of advantage. Since the cards go into the graveyard, everybody knows in Commander your graveyard is your second hand, so you could probably take advantage of those. Gifts Ungiven gets used as a toolboxy kind of card in Constructed. You could fetch up 4 sweepers, and then it doesn't really matter what your opponent chooses to give you and what your opponent puts in your graveyard because you're just going to get 2 sweepers anyway. But I think this card is a little bit too efficient at tutoring in Commander, where you can just find 4 cards that don't care about being in the graveyard, and basically this ends up being a 4-for-1 tutor, where if your opponent sends certain cards to the graveyard, they're damned if you do, damned if you don't, because those cards function from the graveyard. Very easy to break this, and if your opponent doesn't give you the 2 cards you want, you probably fetched other ways to get those cards back. So pretty easy to find piles of cards where you're just hyper advantaged after resolving this anyway, and it doesn't really matter what your opponent's choice is. Not to mention that there's a collusion involved, right? Everybody likes a good politics card. You can use Gifts Ungiven and collaborate with an opponent to fetch up whatever 2 cards you want from your library. And if they're working with you, they can just give you whatever you want. All right, moving into the next category, the big no-no of Commander, Mana Denial and Stacks effect. Stacks coming from the name Smokestack, which is basically a mana denial card when you think about it. Effects that make it so that your opponent can't play the game, can't do certain things. You don't get to do this, you don't get to do that. The really nasty stuff that a lot of people are just very much turned off from in Commander. First card in this category is Balance. Balance is a sorcery for 1 and a white that says each player chooses a number of lands they control equal to the number of lands controlled by the player who controls the fewest, then sacrifices the rest. Players discard cards and sacrifice creatures the same way. So whoever has the least number of lands on board, each player sacks down to that amount. Whoever has the least number of cards in hand, everybody discards to that amount. And whoever has the least creatures on board, everybody sacrifices creatures down to that amount. Obviously, the thing that breaks this card is when somebody has nothing. When somebody has 0 creatures, it's just a board wipe. When somebody has an empty hand or they cast Balance and that's the last card in their hand, everybody discards their hands. And of course, the really nasty thing here, if you are able to, say, sack your lands before casting Balance, you can make everybody sack all of their lands, right? As long as you have 0 lands when this resolves, Balance will make everybody else sack all of their lands, sack all of their creatures, discard their hand. This is a miserable card to play against in Commander. So I have no qualms with this card remaining on the ban list. It's also worth noting that you can break this with artifact mana. The way to kind of break symmetry on balance is to get a bunch of soul rings and mana rocks and arcane signets. Get them all out on the board quick. Use that mana to dump your hand as fast as possible. Play as few lands as possible, or have a card like Zurin Orb, which lets you sacrifice your lands, and then you cast Balance, your opponents lose all their lands, you had no creatures on board, so it board wipes for 2 mana, and you deployed your hand super fast, so your opponents are probably going to have to discard a bunch of cards as well. Just very miserable, removes a lot of resources from the game, not that hard to break Symmetry on, and put yourself super far ahead. I'm perfectly fine with this card staying where it's at on the ban list. The original Braids is the next card on this list. Braids Cabal Minion is 2 black for a 2/2. It is a legendary human minion. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices an artifact, creature, or land. So a very similar effect to Smokestack, which is not on the commander ban list. But I believe the reason Braids is on the commander ban list is because it's a legendary creature. You can put it in the command zone. You can have your dark ritual effects to get this out on turn 1, if you can get a couple extra treasure tokens or something to sacrifice to Braids, or you can get a bunch of junk on the board to keep sacrificing. This can put a real damper on your opponents being able to build out their board. You play this on, like, let's say turn 2, it goes to, you're on the play, you play this on turn 2 with a ritual or something like that, you pass, and then, the person has to sacrifice their land on upkeep, and then the next person sacrifices their land. This just eats all of the lands if you play it early enough in the game, and if you play it later in the game, it probably drops off a significant amount, especially with how much junk people just have on board these days with treasure tokens and clue tokens and stuff like that. But early on, this puts a real damper on anybody being able to build up their board, and presumably if you're putting Braids in your deck, you have a way to break parity, you have a way to get a lot more permanents on board that you can sacrifice. Just a miserable card that doesn't do anything positive for the game, so I'm fine with this one remaining banned, although I think this is one of the cards that could be unbanned, and we would just, poo-poo and give evil looks to the people who put this card in their deck, but people would do it, and it would detract from the overall fun of a lot of people playing the games with the person who has Braids. I think it could be unbanned. I think it's more fun overall. It's net positive if it remains banned. Limited Resources is up next, the enchantment that inspired the name for the LR podcast. It's a single white mana for an enchantment. When it comes into play, when it enters the battlefield, each player chooses 5 lands they control and sack the rest. Players can't play lands as long as 10 or more lands are on the battlefield. So this card came out in Exodus. It was obviously not designed with multiplayer games in mind, so the idea was you and your opponent would both sack down to 5 lands, and then the game would be stagnant in terms of mana production. Nobody would be able to play more lands as long as limited resources was on board. This takes a whole new meaning in Commander, where you can just play it. Before people even get to 5 lands, you can just play it on, like, turn 3, and as long as there are 10 total lands on the battlefield, nobody can play more lands. So again, you can break that with artifact mana, get really far ahead. In just 2 or 3 turn cycles, most people have a total of 10 lands on the battlefield, and you can play this without ever making people sacrifice lands to the first effect, and just, again, make it very hard for people to produce mana. They could still ramp. The interesting thing is you can still fetch lands and stuff like that, so there are ways around this, but it's very easy to be the person who's ramping, get a bunch of lands into play as early as possible, and then play limited resources and make it very hard for your opponents to develop their mana. Not to mention, you could play this when everybody has 10 to 12 lands on the battlefield and make everybody sack down to 5, and people really frown on the land destruction, even though this doesn't completely remove the lands from the game like something like Ravages of War or Armageddon. It's still quite annoying. It just wasn't designed with multiplayer in mind. It takes on new meaning in Commander that wasn't originally there when it came out. I think this card is fine to remain banned, even though there are ways around it. It can make a game very stagnant and very unfun, so let's just keep this one where it's at. Up next is Sundering Titan, 8 colorless mana for a 7/10 artifact creature golem. When it enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, choose a land of each basic land type and destroy those lands. So this is just turbo land destruction on a colorless creature, an artifact creature nonetheless, which are really easy to reanimate and loop from the graveyard and stuff like that. And the real offensive thing here is that it triggers when it leaves the battlefield too. So on ETB, you pop a bunch of lands. It leaves the battlefield, you pop a bunch of lands. You reanimate it, pop a bunch of lands. It just persistently destroys a bunch of lands on the battlefield and does it at a disproportionate rate to your opponents than it does to you. Very, very nasty with flicker effects and reanimation effects. Just makes it very hard, again, for people to develop their mana. Very similar to limited resources, and for that reason, it could just remain banned. I think you could unban this and just have it be a boogeyman of the format, and people don't want to play with you because you play Sunder and Titan. But in the spirit of, letting people do the things that they designed their casual commander decks to do, Sunder and Titan can just stay put. All right, so moving right along, and just as a side note, sorry if my voice just changed or the volume had a little bit of a shift there, but there was a problem with my recording, so I'm actually re-recording part of this section with the stacks cards, so I get to talk about these miserable cards a second time. You only get to hear it once, but hooray, what a bundle of joy. Our next card here is Arayo Soratami Ascendant. It's 1 and a blue for a 1/1 fly-in Moonfolk Monk, a legendary creature. Whenever the 4th spell of a turn is cast, flip Arayo Soratami Ascendant. And then it flips into a legendary enchantment that just has the ability counter the first spell played by each opponent each turn. So you might be familiar with that, the flipped version of this card. I believe Jace, Unraveler of Secrets, has this ability as an emblem, and it's a really strong effect. Obviously, if you could just rattle off a bunch of cantrips or something like that and get this flipped, it's going to be a nuisance to the opponents. It doesn't completely lock them out, but it does become super problematic. The reason this card, I believe, is banned, I haven't really ever read justification on this one. It's not something that I've seen come up that often, but I'm assuming the reason this is banned is because it's really easy to combo this with cards that limit your opponents to only casting 1 spell per turn anyway. There are things like Eidolon of Rhetoric, which says, players can only cast 1 spell per turn. There's Deafening Silence. And with those types of effects on board, Arayo basically just says counter, everything your opponents are going to cast for the rest of the turn or rest of the game. It's also a legendary creature, so this can be your commander. It counts as one of the 4 spells if you cast this from the command zone and then go cantrip, 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 flip it. It also counts your opponent's spells. So if you have this on board and your opponent casts a spell and you can rattle off 3 instants during that same turn, this will flip, and then it just becomes a nuisance from there. So I can't imagine there's any good to be done with this card. I say that for a lot of things, but people have evil intentions in Commander when it comes to stuff like this and stacks pieces. So keep this ban too easy to flip and way too easy to combo with other cards and just lock people out from being able to cast spells for the rest of the game. Following that up, we have Sway of the Stars. So if you made me put on a blindfold and list off every single card that's on the ban list from memory, I believe Sway of the Stars is the one card that I would never remember because I don't think I've ever even seen a copy of this card, and I can't imagine people would even really want to play this card if it was unbanned. It's just a really wonky effect. But what we have here is 8 blue. It is a sorcery. Each player shuffles his or her hand, graveyard, and permanents he or she owns into his or her library, then draws 7 cards. Each player's life total becomes 7. So for 10 mana, you basically reset the game. Everybody gets rid of everything. Everybody draws 7 cards, but the life totals become 7. The problem with this card is the same problem that we're going to see with Upheaval. If you can generate tons of mana, like I'm talking about actual tons of mana, like 20 to 30 mana, it's very possible to float 30 mana, use 10 of it to cast Sway of the Stars, reset everybody's game, but still have the remaining 20 mana floating for your new hand of cards, and just dump that and be very far ahead of the game. You even get to play a land for turn and stuff like that. I might as well talk about Upheaval at the same time, which is the next card on this list. Upheaval is 6 mana for a sorcery that says return all permanents to their owner's hands. Both of these cards sweep up all of the lands off the battlefield, and they both have that interaction where you can just float a bunch of mana, make everybody grab all their permanents, and then use your floating mana to deploy things. They don't really make modern day versions of these effects, especially ones that deal with all the lands on the battlefield at the same time. The closest thing I can think of is World Purge, which isn't even a recent card, and that's like an 8 mana card that does the same thing. It makes everybody pick up all their permanents, but it also has the ability that it empties your mana pool, so it gets around that whole floating mana thing. People aren't really playing World Purge. I can't imagine if Sway of the Stars was unbanned that people would want to play it. Like, nobody ever sits down at my commander tables and says, man, I wish they would take Sway of the Stars off the ban list, you know? Like, nobody wants to play with this card. It's really hard to shape a game plan around it. You know, there are comparable effects. For 10 mana, you could cast, you know, an Omniscience, or for even less, you could cast an Expropriate and just win the game with that, and those cards aren't banned. I think you could safely unban Sway of the Stars, you know, to the same degree that people unbanned Worldfire recently. And, you know, the only people who are out there playing Worldfire are literally the people who want to watch the world burn. So, Sway of the Stars, probably, like, fine to unban, but doesn't really have a positive effect on Commander games, so fine to leave banned. I don't have a strong opinion on this one. Upheaval is definitely a leave this card banned. You know, the difference between that costing 6 and this costing 10 is just, like, a huge, huge deal. So, Sway of the Stars, take it or leave it. Upheaval, leave it banned. All right, this next one very recently hit the ban list. It's actually one of the newest cards in Commander. It might be the newest card that's been printed to hit the ban list. I don't really know what they were thinking with this one, but Hull Breacher, 2 and a blue for a 3/2 Merfolk Pirate with Flash. And if an opponent would draw a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, instead you create a treasure token. Just absolutely 100% shuts the door on extra draws, period. And unlike something like Narset, Parter of Veils, this stops extra draws outside of their turn. They get to draw one card during their draw phase, and they do not get to draw ever outside of any interaction. You know, with Narset, you could potentially get around it by drawing cards during the other player's turns, at least one card per turn, you know, per player's turns. Hull Breacher says nope. And the fact that Hull Breacher puts you up on treasure for doing it is just absolutely ludicrous. You know, it cuts off your opponent's avenues for dealing with the card because they're only going to be able to look at so many cards to, you know, help find an answer for it in the first place. And then you're just up on treasure anytime anyone would draw extra cards. It has Flash too, which is just so annoying. You can just get people's extra draws or, you know, their Blue Sun Zenith, Stroke of Genius type effects and be like, haha, now I'm up on 7 or 8 mana and you get to draw nothing and you spent your whole turn casting that spell. Just miserable stuff like this. I am perfectly fine with this stuff being banned. I don't think anybody liked playing with Hull Breacher. It felt kind of dirty to do it. You know, people played with their Commander Legends stuff. There was Opposition Agent, Jeweled Lotus, all this broken stuff that came out in the first Commander Legends. Hull Breacher ended up being the most powerful of those because it just cuts your opponents off. Just hard cuts them off, kind of like a Notion Thief that just leaves you up on extra mana. And, you know, you can combo this with like a wheel effect, and suddenly your opponents have no cards and you're up 21 mana or something like that. So just absolutely ridiculous. I don't know why this card was pushed. And maybe this wouldn't even fix the problem. This card should have let your opponents make treasure when they skip their draws, right? Instead of your opponents drawing cards, they make treasure tokens. Instead, it's just like all downside for the opponents and all upside for you. There's no repercussions to casting this card. It's just miserable. So leave it banned forever, please. This card did not need to exist. It did not do anything positive for EDH while it existed, for the little bit of time that it was around. And I can mimic a lot of what I just said about Hull Breacher for Leovold, Emissary of Trest. This is a black, green, blue, 3 mana for a 3/3 legendary Elf Advisor. Each opponent can't draw more than one card each turn, and whenever you or a permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. So it has that same kind of feel. This is more along the lines of Narset, you know, Spirit of the Labyrinth, than it is Hull Breacher or Notion Thief. This one just says your opponents get 1 draw per turn maximum. You don't get any real advantage for them drawing extra cards. You're not up on treasure. You don't get to draw the cards that they would be drawing, but you do lock them down to 1 card per turn. You know, they can get around it with the instant speed draw effects, or if they have like a creature that can tap to draw a card, they can use that during somebody else's turn and still get their card advantage that way. So it's not a hard lock in the same way that Hull Breacher is. It's still terribly miserable to play against, and this one I think got the hammer because it is legendary, and you could just have this be your commander. Before this got banned, I did play against a couple people who, you know, those sick degenerates out there who had Leovold decks, and they were full of wheels and stuff like that, and you basically just win by cutting your opponent off resources. You don't even really need to do much on your end. You just need to cast like a wheel, and you're just so far ahead on card advantage, and your opponents can't recoup that card advantage while Leovold's out. And having access to that game plan in your command zone for 3 mana every single turn, obviously you can see how you would be ahead for most of the game. On top of that, if your opponents ever tried to deal with Leovold or targeted you with anything, you just get to draw extra cards, so it's hard not to be ahead on card advantage when you have a Leovold on board. Not a fun card by any means. I'm not 100% sure this card needed the ban hammer. This is more of like a social thing, I would say. People don't really ban like the Notion Thieves and Narsets. Hull Breacher, I think, deserved to be banned because it gave you extra advantage on top of stopping other people, and I guess that's true of Leovold, but I wonder if this wasn't a legendary creature, if it would be fine. It would still be very annoying, but it wouldn't be as consistent. As it is, as a legendary creature, a 3-mana card you can put in your command zone and wheel as early as turn 4, I say we just leave it alone, keep it on the ban list. It's not a fun card to play against. And the final stacks piece I have the pleasure of talking about today, the Queen. She was taken from me way too early. Iona, Shield of Emeria, 6 white, white, white for a 7/7 angel with flying. As Iona, Shield of Emeria enters the battlefield, choose a color. Your opponents can't cast spells of the chosen color. So just absolute hard lock on one of the 5 colors in Magic. Approximately 20% of all cards that exist are no longer castable from your opponents. An asymmetrical effect, so you still have free reign to cast whatever you need to. This card got banned because it's unfun, and to some degree, I agree that this is unfun. I'm actually team unban Iona, or team we don't need to ban Iona, and my reason is twofold. One, this card normally doesn't just completely shut off the game. What happens is you cut one player out, and then everybody else starts to kind of like commiserate and, oh, that person can't cast their spells. Let's deal with this Iona. And then they deal with it. At least that's the like casual EDH response I see. In CEDH, you would probably just let it sit around and hose a player, That's one less player you have to worry about. But in casual EDH, like, people kind of rally against the Iona and they'll work to get it off the battlefield. Sometimes it does kind of lock everybody out. If you're against a Sultai opponent and a mono blue player and a teamer opponent, obviously you're cutting off blue from all of them, and it's going to make it a lot harder for them to cast spells. Kind of like a Void Winnower, but a little more inclusive in the, range of spells that it cuts off. The other reason that I'm pro, unban this is the reason they gave for banning it in the first place was kind of silly. They said something along the lines of, and maybe somebody can point me to the article where Iona got announced as a ban card. They said something close to the effect of, we were surprised to find out people weren't casting Iona for 9 mana. They were cheating it into play with animate deads and stuff like that. And it's like, no duh, people don't pay 9 mana for their 9 mana creatures. They reanimate them. They blink them into play. They cheat them into play with different effects and stuff like that. I thought it was just very comical that the people who are responsible for banning cards seemed like they were surprised that people weren't hard casting their 9 mana white creature 5 years ago or something like that. But anyway, I think Iona could be unbanned, and it's another one of those cards where it's evaluate the social aspect of the casual games you're playing in. If you're not playing with people who don't really care for this sort of stacksy stuff, just don't play the card. Or if people in your meta are playing this sort of stuff, rally against them and take them down before they get to the point where they can do stuff like this. I admit this can be a miserable card, especially if it's heads up Magic 1v1, or you've narrowed it down, 2 people have been eliminated, and it's just you versus the mono black deck. Then yes, it feels like an automatic win to some degree, but there are colorless options for dealing with cards like this that are universally playable. Meteor Golem, Cityscape Leveler, I should say, stuff like that. So if this popped up in your meta, I would adjust to be able to deal with it, but, it's not a fun card, so the fact that it's on the ban list is probably net positive. I am team unban Iona, though. I think it's safe to take this one off. All right, our next category is a little small, and these cards are pretty easy to talk about because they all kind of have the same goal in mind. These are the insta-wins, the cards that when you cast them, they have a chance to just end the game on the spot. The first one is Biorhythm, which is 6 green for a sorcery that says each player's life total becomes the number of creatures they control. So if a player has 0 creatures on board, their life total just becomes 0. If you have 10 creatures on board, your life total becomes 10. It affects everybody equally. There is a creature called Shaman of the Forgotten Ways that has a formidable ability that does the same exact thing, and that does end games sometimes. Sometimes that's a viable strategy. I think the reason this is banned is because it's just a little bit too easy to, either ramp into this early or wipe the board and then cast this and just end the game. Not to mention that sometimes it just ends the game in a draw, which is just not fun. If somebody plays like Evacuation, return all creatures to their owner's hands, and then follows up with Biorhythm, the game just ends in a draw, right? And it's not too hard to like be the person who bounces all the creatures back to hand and then deploys one threat and casts Biorhythm, and the game just ends. I'm assuming that the people who control the Commander ban list look at this card and they see it say something along the lines of, the game ends, but we don't know in whose favor, right? It just puts the game to a sudden end. It's not very likely that, Biorhythm resolves and everybody's at like 10 to 15 life. Someone's going to be at 2, someone's going to be at 3, someone's going to be at 15, and there's probably going to be one person who has no creatures and they just die immediately. So I get it. I think this card could be unbanned. It's a little cheesy to win with. It's actually pretty easy to win with too. But, Shaman of the Forgotten Ways already exists. That card's there. It's a little bit harder to use than Biorhythm, but I think this is just another one where people are either not going to be clamoring to play it because, it's pretty unfun. It just invalidates a game here and there. Or they're going to play it in like some cheesy deck that people are going to be onto, and people are just going to make sure they never walk into Biorhythm. So I don't know. Unban this card and let people have their fun if they consider this sort of thing fun. One of the other big splashy sorceries in the same category is Coalition Victory, and this is one that comes up in conversation a lot as a card that people say is safe to unban, and I'm not sure if I agree with that or not. It's 3 and Wooburg, so 8 mana total, 1 of each color plus 3 generic mana for a sorcery. You win the game if you control land of each basic land type and a creature of each color. Now, I think when this was created, the intention was, hey, you're going to need a forest, a basic forest on board, a basic plains, a basic island, so on and so forth, and you're going to need 5 different creatures that are all different colors, and you're going to have to put in all this work, when in reality, you could just play a 5-color creature and have a land that's all basic land types, or, like a Triome and a Shock land that cover all 5 basic land types, and that fulfills the condition. This can be fulfilled with as little as like 2 to 3 cards, especially given that there are creatures out there that just are all 5 colors, and effects that turn lands into all basic land types and stuff like that. Think like your Dryad of Elysian Grove, Nylea's Presence, there's other effects like that out there, Prismatic Omen, plenty of effects that just make it so that you have all basic land types. The reason I think maybe this card could be unbanned, and it's kind of cheesy in the same sense as like Biorhythm, it's just like you cast a sorcery and you just win the game. Approach of the Second Sun is very much like that for me too, but there's this time period where people get to just kind of beat up on you before you actually win the game with that one. This one, when it works, is just 8 mana, sorcery, you win the game. And, all you have to do is set up the board. You do have to do a little bit of setup, but not that much. The game just ends, so it's kind of like a very anticlimactic way to end the game. And I think that's kind of the main reason I would like to see it still be banned, is I just don't want the game to end because you cast a sorcery that said you win the game. Especially when in Commander you don't have to put in a lot of work. But I think if there is an argument for unbanning this card, it's that it's a 5-color card. And when you're playing 5-color EDH decks, you already have access to everything, like literally the entire card pool. So you can win with the most powerful cards if you really want to. This is amplifying a 5-color deck, and 5-color decks tend to be the most powerful decks when the mana is really consistent and you go for, really powerful effects and spells and stuff like that. So I don't think this makes like a 5-color deck better necessarily. This doesn't take a really powerful 5-color deck and turn it into, a more powerful deck. It's just an addition to a deck that's probably already powerful, and it just adds this kind of like alternative cheesy win con to the deck. So yeah, in my final line here, I guess I have to give an opinion about it. I say just keep it banned because it's just a miserable way for the game to end. It's just very anticlimactic. It's kind of like that enchantment that literally says the game ends in a draw. I can't think of the name of it off my top of my head, but after like 2 turns, the game is a draw or something like that. It's just like, oh, okay. I guess we played that game. It invalidates everything else that came before it. If it doesn't get countered, there's not really like a lot of counterplay to it. It's just the cheese, and I'm not a huge fan of the cheese in Commander. It's very similar to Biorhythm, but Biorhythm can backfire. Anyway, Coalition Victory, just, I don't know, leave this ban. I don't really want to lose to this card, and I don't feel like building around it. So that's my justification on this one. Leave it banned. All right, the next two we can go through pretty quickly because they're just infinite turn combo cards that don't really need to be in Commander. Panoptic Mirror is a 5-mana artifact that has Imprint. You can pay X mana and tap it to exile an instant or sorcery with mana value X from your hand, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may copy a card exiled with Panoptic Mirror. If you do, you can cast that copy without paying its mana cost. The idea here is you put an extra turn spell underneath this, and you get to take infinite turns, and you don't have to pay any extra mana for those extra turns. So I don't know that we need to say anything else about this. Easy to enable infinite turns like this, just don't need them in Commander. Same goes for the next one, Time Vault. This is a 2-mana artifact that enters the battlefield tapped, does not untap during your untap step, and if you would begin your turn while Time Vault is tapped, you may skip that turn instead to untap Time Vault, and it taps to take an extra turn after this one. The cheese here is if you can get any effect on board that untaps an artifact, you can just keep tapping this to take extra turns, and you never have to reap the repercussions of skipping any of those turns. Usually takes one full turn cycle to get going because this already comes into play tap, but if you already have the untapper on board, you just get to immediately take extra turns forever and ever. It is the easiest way in Magic, I think, to just take infinite turns, and nobody has a copy of this anyway, so I don't think anyone's ever tried to get this removed from the ban list. Another small category we can blast through here are the time-wasting cards. There are 2 of them in this category, the first of which is Paradox Engine. 5 colorless mana for a legendary artifact. Whenever you cast a spell, untap all non-land permanents you control. I have no idea who thought this was a good card to put in the print. I don't know if this was printed specifically for Commander or not. It is broken as all hell. If you've ever played against a Paradox Engine deck, anything, it doesn't even matter what the build of their deck is. If they can do anything with Paradox Engine, 2 things are true. A, you're going to lose the game, and B, it's going to take 30 minutes for that to happen. All of the wheel spinning of tapping and untapping and tracking mana from the mana rocks and casting spells, and sometimes it's a storm deck. It's just way too much. This card is super powerful, and it's powerful in a way that just wastes everybody's time at the table. Paradox Engine, good riddance. This was my favorite card to get banned from the format. I am not clamoring to have it back anytime soon. And then in the same category, we have Shahrazad, white for a sorcery. I'm not even going to read this card. Look it up on your own time. It's probably on the screen right now if you're watching the YouTube video. It makes you play a sub-game, and then the the reward for winning the sub-game is just kind of like not even that big of a deal. We don't need to be playing sub-games in Commander, okay? I understand that some people like that sort of gimmicky thing. This just wastes everybody's time, and unless everybody's on the same page about this sort of stuff, it's just not even worth it. So keep this on the ban list just so that people don't get any ideas about it. I really don't want to be playing sub-games in Commander. It's just, that's not my jam. Maybe it's yours, but it's not mine. We've got a couple cards in this next category, just 2 in the hyper efficiency category, and some of the cards we've already talked about could fit here as well. The first one is another power card. Time Walk is blue for a sorcery that lets you take an extra turn. I'm sorry, it's actually 1 in a blue, not blue, so it's even easier to cast, just as efficient as an extra turn spell can ever get. This is why we call extra turn spells Time Walks. This is why we call it a Time Walk when somebody just doesn't do anything with their turn. In Commander, way too easy to loop this. It's a 2-mana spell. It does not exile itself from the graveyard. We have Time Warp, which is the fixed version of this, the same exact card, but for 5 mana instead of 2, and it's trivially easy to break Time Warp if you want to do that as well. Time Walk does not have a place in Commander. It's just way too cheap for this sort of effect, along the same lines as Ancestral Recall. The other spell I put on here for hyper efficiency is Tinker, 2 in a blue for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact and search your library for any artifact and put it on the battlefield. So again, in a format where you can play Sol Ring, just very easy to go, turn 1 Sol Ring, maybe you have to wait till turn 2 and you sacrifice one of your artifacts to fetch up your Blightsteel Colossus or your Bolas's Citadel or whatever your big game winning artifact is, and you're just so far ahead of the opponents. That sacrificing an artifact is supposed to be kind of like a gate to entry to be able to cast this powerful spell, but it's so trivially easy to do that this just ends up being a 3-mana tutor for any artifact put it on the battlefield with almost no cost, and that's just unreasonable. Whatever artifact you can think of that can just win the game on its own, you have access to it with Tinker. So Tinker, Time Walk, sorry, too efficient, stay on the ban list. All right, that brings us down to 2 more categories, and then we'll talk about the cards that some people want to be banned. This next category is what I'm going to call the sneak attackers. These are the creatures that have these super powerful effects, and if they were legal in Commander, people would just be finding ways to cheat them into play. Nobody would be casting these cards fairly. They would be just unfairly put into play, and they would gain you so much advantage that the game would spiral out of control. Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, is an obvious card in this category. 15 colorless mana. You know this one. Every Magic player knows this one. 15/15, can't be countered. When you cast it, take an extra turn, flying, protection from spells that are 1 or more colors, Annihilator 6, and it has the Eldrazi clause of shuffling your graveyard back into your library. Supposed to be a workaround to reanimation spells, but you can use instant speed reanimation to bring this back. There are ways to get Emrakul out on turn 1. Nobody would be paying 15 mana for Emrakul. They would be cheating it in with some sort of Ilharg type effect or, some sort of mana producing effect that makes a bunch of colorless mana. Just not impossible to cast this super early in the game and just Annihilator 6 everybody out of control. I think if you took the extra turn clause off of Emrakul, it would be a little bit more justifiable in Commander, but Annihilator 6 is just such a big number. When you compare this to the other Eldrazi Titan, this one just does so much damage when it gets that attack in that the game almost immediately ends for whoever's attacked. And obviously in heads up 1 versus 1 Commander, this just takes over the game. This is the big baddie of Magic the Gathering as far as giant creatures you can put into play and attack with, and I think that still holds up in Commander. Emrakul can't be healthy for the format, so just keep it where it's at. Same goes for the next one. Everybody knows Griselbrand would be broken in Commander, and anyone who tells you this card would be fine in Commander is lying to you. Griselbrand is 4 black for a 7/7 legendary demon with flying and lifelink, and most importantly, pay 7 life, draw 7 cards. We already talked about this with Yawgmoth's Bargain. This is basically Yawgmoth's Bargain on a more expensive fly and lifelinker that can be your Commander, which is absurd. In fact, it's even better than Yawgmoth's Bargain because it's just way easier to cheat this into play with reanimation effects than it is to get a 6 mana enchantment on board. Nobody would cast 8 mana for Griselbrand. They would reanimate it, they would entomb it and bring it back. They would do whatever they can to put it on board, and then they would pay 28 life to draw, what is that, 28 cards, I guess? Yeah, that makes sense. The numbers add up. Broken. Griselbrand, super broken. It might not be the all-star reanimation target in constructed formats anymore, but this card would be utterly ridiculous to have in Commander format. I don't think we'll ever see this one. Sylvan Primordial is an interesting one because it looks like just a bulk bin, draft filler card, but when you scale it to a Commander game, it actually becomes this just enormous threat. It's 5 green for a 6/8 with reach. It's an avatar creature. When it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, destroy target non-creature permanent they control. For each permanent destroyed this way, search your library for a forest, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. So on turn 7, this would be a fine card. If you could make it so that Sylvan Primordial could only be cast on turn 7, this card wouldn't need to be banned. The problem is, you can reanimate this card, you can sneak attack it into play, you can ramp into it on turn 3 if you really, really want to, and then you pop a land from each opponent and you ramp 3 times. You get a forest for each thing. So not only are you super far ahead on mana, but your opponents are set really far behind, and the fact that you would be able to just play this super early in a game of Commander gives you just this huge advantage that I think most people wouldn't be able to keep up with. It's kind of like a Terastodon on steroids, and Terastodon's still kind of on steroids itself. This card, as dorky as it looks and as often as you see this just in local game store bulk boxes, it's a very powerful card. It's one of the only cards on this list that just doesn't have a presence in any other format, and because of the way that it works in a multiplayer format, it just needs to be banned. And the last creature in this category is Primeval Titan, 4 green for a 6/6 giant with trample. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may search your library for up to 2 land cards, put them on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. Just way too easy to cheese this. I don't really even know off the top of my head what combination of lands you can get to kind of go pseudo-infinite with this card, but it's not too hard to just get completely out of control with Primeval Titan, copy it a couple times, copy its enter the battlefield trigger, attack with it, take extra combats, get this down super, super early because you ramped really hard, and just get super far ahead of all of your opponents on lands. Again, people question this sometimes. I know every now and then a person will come around and say, well, Primeval Titan's not as bad as blah, blah, blah. And I assure you it is. If you were to ever unban this card, you would just see people jamming it on turn 3, and it would just feel insurmountable. You would feel like you would never be able to keep up on mana. And if they're able to ramp into this on turn 3, imagine what they can ramp into after this card has untapped, fetched 2 lands, attacks, and gets 2 more lands. It's just absurd and spirals out of control. So Primeval Titan, sorry, not going anywhere. And with that, I wanted to mention one more card here on the ban list, which I think fits into this category. That is Flash. Flash is 1 and a blue for an instant. You may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. If you do, sacrifice it unless you pay its mana cost reduced by up to 2 colorless mana. So the idea here is you use Flash to instant speed cast one of your creatures. You then either sacrifice it or you pay its mana cost. You're still paying the total amount, right? You're paying 2 for Flash, but you're paying 2 less for the creature. The problem, of course, is that you're not trying to keep that creature with Flash. You're using Flash as a way to just cheat a giant creature into play, maybe even get its death trigger, and it's just a little bit too efficient at making sure you get one of your ETBs or leave the battlefield effects. Just to highlight how powerful this card is, it used to be played alongside Protean Hulk. Protean Hulk is now unbanned, but I believe they used to be banned together, and you would use this to just put Protean Hulk into play. You don't care, the Protean Hulk sticks around because it has a death trigger, and it would die, and you would get your Protean Hulk trigger right away for just 2 mana. As early as turn 2, you could proc a Protean Hulk trigger. You used to be able to do the same thing with Sundering Titan, where you could just flash Sundering Titan into play, blow up a bunch of lands. It would leave the battlefield, blow up a bunch more lands. Flash just enables some really gross things on creatures with powerful ETB or death triggers, and does it for just 2 mana at instant speed. So I think I'm fine with Flash being banned. I didn't really ever see people using this for evil in casual Commander, but I understand the whole Flash Hulk thing was this big thing in Commander or in CEDH, and I can understand why people would want this banned. I don't think it really justifies using it fairly, and the unfair uses of it are a little bit too good. All right, so our last big category here are the cards that just do not translate well to multiplayer or to games of Commander, and this is highlighted by our first card here, Karakas. Karakas is a legendary land that taps for white mana or taps to return a legendary creature to its owner's hand. This card came out in Legends. I want to say Legends was when Karakas was printed, and, obviously was not designed with Commander in mind. Commander came around a lot later on, and Commander is a format that revolves around legendary creatures, which makes Karakas just completely broken. There's no downside to it. You could just replace a plains. It doesn't come in tapped. It taps for colored mana even, so it's pretty free to put in any deck that could play white, and if you were playing white in Commander, you would just have this card in your deck, full stop, no questions asked, and it does a lot of different things. It disrupts your opponent's legendary creatures. It makes it so that their commanders can't really stick on board. Half the creatures that get printed every set now are legendary, so this disrupts all of those, and you could even use it to just save your own commander since it can target your legendary creatures as well. It's just too versatile in what it does. It functions a little bit too well at what it's supposed to do when you factor it into a game of Commander, and I think there's no real reason to unban this. Maybe you could do a retrain of this card where it costs some amount of mana to activate the second ability and comes in tapped, but as it is, it's just a little bit too efficient of an effect that you can just hide on a land, and a little bit too disruptive in a format that is basically centered around legendary creatures. Trade Secrets is a similar card. This is 1 blue for a sorcery. Target opponent draws 2 cards, then you draw up to 4 cards. That opponent may repeat this process as many times as they choose. The problem here is that this was printed in Onslaught, again, before multiplayer play was really being considered super hard, and this was meant as a 1 versus 1 card, where you would draw 4 cards, but you would give your opponent 2 cards, and then if your opponent wanted a few more cards, they would have to let you draw a bunch more cards, and you would be always up in the exchange. When you port this over to a multiplayer format, it's just way too easy to collude with someone. If I cast this on somebody who's agreed to kind of help me out, I could draw 40 cards and they could draw 20 cards for 3 mana. That seems a little bit unreasonable to me. I think you would get very annoyed if people were casting trade secrets. If you ever became kind of public enemy number 1 in a game of Commander and somebody had trade secrets and they're like, hey, you want to draw a bunch of cards and I'll draw a bunch of cards, and suddenly you're facing down 60 to 80 more cards than you were before for 3 mana, I think you would be a little bit annoyed, right? This card just doesn't translate into multiplayer games the way that it was designed to. It was meant for this kind of 1v1, little exchange, and it just doesn't maintain that when you put it into a game of Commander. So trade secrets is exceptionally broken in Commander. It wasn't built for it, and it's fine that it doesn't exist in that format, even though it was printed in Commander 2011. So somebody out there thought that was okay. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this next one, but Golos Tireless Pilgrim got the axe maybe a year or two ago. This is the 5 mana, 3/5 legendary artifact scout. When it enters the battlefield, you search for a land and put it on the battlefield tapped, and you can pay Wooburg plus 2 mana to exile the top 3 cards of your library and play them without paying their mana cost that turn. The reason this got banned, and I kind of agree with it, is that it's so hyper efficient. It's so good at just making sure you always have mana and mana sync on board that it kind of invalidated a lot of other 5-color commanders. There's not a lot of reason other than personal preference to play a different 5-color commander when you could have played Golos instead, because it always fixes your mana, always makes sure you have 5 mana on board, and gives you this explosive activated ability. Also very hard to keep up with if you ever had the displeasure of playing against a Golos commander deck. You know that you can't really kill Golos because they just play it and get another land, and it always half pays for its mana, the commander tax. So Golos isn't really banned on power level. It's banned on its ubiquity in the format, and I think that's okay because it kind of forces people to be a little bit more creative in their deck building. I did see a lot of Golos when it was legal in Commander, and people are now forced to play different 5-color decks. Granted, they can still play the same shell that Golos was in or Golos was leading, but they do have to make a few concessions. They don't just have this super powerful card that they can always rely on from the command zone, and I think that's a net positive. I'm okay with Golos staying banned. Okay, big hot button card here, Lutri the Spell Chaser. 1 and 2 Izzet hybrid mana, so 3 mana total. It's a 3/2 elemental otter. It's legendary. It has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you copy an instant or sorcery you control, and you may choose new targets. Most importantly, this has a companion clause, and the companion cost is that each non-land card in your starting deck has a different name. There are definitely people out there who claim that we should hashtag free the otter, and I am not one of those people. The card is not very powerful. It's like a dual caster mage that can only target your own stuff. The card, however, is too easy to include and too ubiquitous in what it does that you would see it in 100% of decks that are playing blue and red, and I think that is a net negative for the format, because if you're not playing exactly blue and red and you don't have Lutri the Spell Chaser as your companion, you are starting the game off at a disadvantage. Your opponent technically has 8 cards because they have Lutri, and you start with 7 because you do not have Lutri. And since there's no downside to playing Lutri, you should 100% of the time always include it as a companion, and I think it would just be a little bit too persistent and too ubiquitous, even though the in-game effect is not super powerful. I think having cards in the format that are must-plays is a net negative for Commander because it stifles creativity, and I think Lutri doesn't cost you anything. There's no opportunity cost, literally none, as long as you're playing blue and red in your Commander, or at least you have blue and red in your Commander identity, and you would just have this card, even if you have 0 targets, 0 instants and sorceries that this could ever copy, you still have this tangible extra piece of cardboard that your opponents do not have access to unless they're playing something, some other companion, but they presumably had to give something up for their companions. This card is baffling because it feels like it was designed specifically as a nod to Commander, like the companion cost of having a singleton deck. That's literally what Commander is. but it does feel like it would be a little bit too persistent. It would be a little too common. You would feel obligated to play this card to be competitive. You would sit down at a table with a Grixis deck and a Naya deck and a Teamer deck and a Izzet deck, and 3 people would have Lutri the Spell Chaser and 1 person wouldn't. I think people would get annoyed at seeing this, and they don't realize that because the cards never had a chance in Commander. Okay, 2 more cards to talk about. The next one here is one that I would like people's opinions on. Recurring Nightmare is 2 and a black for an enchantment. As a cost, you may sacrifice a creature and return Recurring Nightmare to its owner's hand. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. So the idea is you sack a creature, you reanimate a creature, you get Recurring Nightmare back. You can recast Recurring Nightmare and loop it. Sacrifice a creature, reanimate a creature. I think it's pretty easy to go infinite with this card. I don't have infinite combos listed off the top of my head for Recurring Nightmare because I've never really played with the card, but it seems trivially easy to loop creatures that can reanimate other creatures or creatures that give mana when they enter the battlefield, one of which we'll talk about here in a couple seconds. So this is probably a safe card on the ban list. I don't really hear people talk about this card very often. I know that it's had its place in Vintage Cube before. I don't have any real experience with it. It does seem like it's a little bit too easy of an engine, and even if it's not going infinite, it feels like it's just a little bit too insurmountable of an advantage engine where you can just sacrifice creatures with ETBs to get back creatures with ETBs and just keep looping it. And whether that's drawing cards or destroying permanents or discarding cards from your opponent's hand, it feels like the loop that this creates is a little bit too hard to disrupt and a little bit problematic for Commander. So I'm okay with Recurring Nightmare staying put because off the top of my head, I can't think of anything positive it would do, and I think people would just immediately go for infinites with it. And I'm imagining that's not that hard to do. Okay, I saved the best for last. This is my big hot take for this entire video. Please unban Prophet of Kruphix. And I know just by saying that, there's like 2 or 3 people out there who are like, "But you can't unban Prophet of Kruphix. It's too strong, blah, 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 blah." Look, every time I mention this in a game store, there's somebody sitting 6 tables away who's like, "No, man, Prophet of Kruphix was way too good. That card can't be unbanned." Look, it could be. It could be unbanned. It could just be a powerful card that exists in our format. We have powerful cards in our format. We have objectively just broken cards in our format, and Prophet of Kruphix would be right up there with some of the best cards in Commander, but it doesn't do anything at face value that warrants being banned. Look at these other cards that we've talked about. Infinite turns, insurmountable advantage. Yes, Prophet of Kruphix comes close to that, but it needs help from other cards. It does a very strong thing. I don't think Prophet of Kruphix fundamentally breaks the game in a way where it needs to be banned, or at least it does so in a way where it rivals other cards that do something very similar. Now, Prophet of Kruphix is a strong card. I want to stress that. This is a very strong card, and when it was legal in Commander, everybody played it in their Simic decks. It was part of the reason Simic, I believe, was the best color combination back then. Whether that's still true or not, I don't know. But everybody would play this card if you unbanned it, and that's fine. People already play powerful cards. We're going to talk about 1 or 2 cards here in just a second that are more powerful than Prophet of Kruphix, but are banned because of how powerful they are. It's okay to have powerful cards in the format. This doesn't break any of the taboos, like mana destruction and walk pieces and stacks. This doesn't do any of the things that a lot of the other cards we're talking about do. Now, there was a problem with this card when they initially banned it. They said that the game started to revolve around it. People were looking for ways to take control of it or copy it. And that's true, but players are going to play. They're going to do exactly what they want to do. And if it's not Prophet of Kruphix, it's whatever else is on the battlefield that's super powerful. If people want to play with powerful cards, let them play with powerful cards, especially when they're not disrupting the flow of the game. They're not locking people out of doing what they need to be doing to participate in the game. You can still participate if there's a Prophet of Kruphix out. You're just going to have to get through that hurdle. The thing that this does is basically quadruple your mana because you get to untap during every player's turn. It is a Seedborn Muse, and it is a Vidalcan Orrery stapled in one, and that is a very powerful combination of effects, but not so powerful that I think this card is worse for the format than some of the cards that already exist in the format. So, hot take. Again, not sure if I give a particularly sound reason in there for it, but I've always felt like Prophet of Krufix could come off the ban list. At least I started to feel that way over the course of the last 4 or 5 years as Commander ramped up and became more powerful. This got banned in 2013 or 14 or something like that. It is 2022. Free the Prophet of Krufix. Hashtag let the Prophet go. I think this card is safe to unban, but would become a very powerful contender in the format. Okay, big sigh of relief. We got through every card on the ban list, but I need to talk about a couple cards here that people often claim they want to be banned, and I'm just going to give my take on whether I agree or disagree with that. So 5 cards to talk about here, starting off with a card that's come up in conversation a lot in the Twitterverse lately, Drannith Magistrate. This is 1 in a white for a 1/3 human wizard. Your opponents can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands. So this had to have been designed with Commander in mind. It was designed in the same set that Lutri came out in, and it basically locks people out of casting their Commander since you're not casting your Commander from your hand, you're casting it from the command zone, while also stopping people from casting spells from their graveyard, from their library, so on and so forth. It is a stacks piece through and through. It's a lock piece against other people's commanders. It comes up a lot in CEDH, I know that much, but it doesn't get played in casual EDH. So my take here is to not ban this card, and that's coming from the perspective of somebody who identifies themselves as a casual player. And I understand people who play CEDH are going to have a different opinion because this card takes on a different role in CEDH. People don't really play this card in casual EDH from what I understand because they understand it has a negative impact on the game. It's not a symmetrical effect. You can still play your commander. It's one of those miser cards that makes people just kind of sit around and do nothing. But I would say, as a counter argument to people who want this banned, if your deck cannot function without your commander, you should probably make a couple concessions to that and change your deck around a little bit. And I'm really bad at that. I'm bad at building commander decks where if the commander doesn't stick on board or I can't cast it, my deck doesn't really do anything. But you need to be playing more single target removal. You need to be playing ways to deal with lock pieces like this. Catch-all removal spells, whatever it is. Maybe that's not what CEDH is about, but you should be doing that anyway in casual EDH so that you don't get caught off guard by a single card. If Drannith Magistrate comes down as a single card and locks you out of being able to play the game, I think that's a deck building error, not an error with this card itself. So I'm going to take the stance of not banning this card, even though I recognize that I don't really know how it functions in CEDH. If you think this card is bannable in CEDH and you just don't see it in casual EDH because of kind of the player consensus to not play stuff like this, then let me know. But I don't really see this being a problem in the format that I typically play, and it feels like you should be able to answer this in the format where it does get played. Next up, a personal gripe of mine, Sol Ring. The one and only Sol Ring, and this is going to be a stand-in for basically a lot of the fast mana cards that tap for more mana than it costs to cast them, so your mana vaults, your mana crypt, stuff like that. Should Sol Ring be banned in Commander? Well, there was a long time where I said yes, please ban Sol Ring in Commander. I do hate the effect that Sol Ring has on Commander. It accelerates you super far ahead. You're basically 2 turns ahead of everybody else when you play it on turn 1. You feel obligated to put it in your deck. It's stifling that creativity because you always need to use 1 slot for Sol Ring. And I know there's a lot of data out there that says, oh, well, the person with Sol Ring doesn't win disproportionately. People tend to gang up on the person who has Sol Ring. My personal experience is that the person who has Sol Ring just gets super far ahead super quickly, and it's hard for other people to keep up unless they are also drawing their Sol Rings. And if they don't, they're 2 turns behind that person. I think that's unfun, but I do think Sol Ring is a little bit too ingrained in what Commander is at this point to ever really touch it on the ban list. So if someone put a gun to my head and said, it's your decisions, ban Sol Ring or leave it unbanned, I would probably ban it, and I think people would gripe about it very early on and then realize that the format's better for having gotten rid of a lot of the fast mana, but it's a little bit too late. Commander's been around for too long. Sol Ring is in every precon that's ever been printed. I don't think we can get rid of it. As me and my friends call it, it's the original sin of Commander. Somebody, made the Commander format and they decided, you know what, Black Lotus and these Moxen, too good for the format, but Sol Ring's legal, even though Sol Ring has a very similar effect on games that those cards do. So I think it's too late to ban Sol Ring. I think it would have some ripple effects where people would get very angry if you ban Sol Ring, but I think it would be a net positive for the format from a play perspective and a deck building creativity perspective that people wouldn't initially see, and then maybe down the line would come to appreciate. I'm not a huge fan of fast mana, but I do feel obligated to play it because other people play it as well. 3 more cards to talk about, and we'll wrap up. Thassa's Oracle, another CEDH All-Star that just makes people really, really upset and, calls for a banning conversation or can ban in discourse on Twitter at least once or twice a week. I'm not really going to give a huge opinion here. I know this is a big player in CEDH. It's one of the main win cons in a lot of different decks. It's very easy to mill your entire library and win with Oracle. It's a really frustrating trigger as well, since dealing with the Oracle in response to the trigger doesn't stop it from happening. I don't think I'm in a place to really say whether to ban Oracle or not. It is such a gimmicky kind of oops, I win type card that I think games are better and people are happier when stuff like this doesn't exist in the format, but I just don't see it enough to have a strong opinion on it. Whatever I said about Drannith Magistrate, go ahead and rewind and just play that back for Thassa's Oracle, because I feel probably about the same here. I think it's a dorky card. I don't like playing it. I wouldn't like losing to it, but does it need to be banned? I'm not 100% sure. Second to last card here, one of the mainstay commander cards, one of the staples, Cyclonic Rift. People hate Cyclonic Rift. They want Cyclonic Rift banned, but hot take maybe, or maybe this is just a lukewarm take, I think Cyclonic Rift is good for the format, and I would not ban it if that choice came to me. I think there are so many times where you are losing, person B is losing, and person B hates Cyclonic Rift. Person C is so far ahead and they are crushing the game, but because I have a Cyclonic Rift and I got to deal with person C's stuff, person A and B get to keep playing the game. It is a good safety valve against a lot of the stuff that's happening in Commander. Now, it's one of those cards that wasn't designed with multiplayer in mind. Obviously, Cyclonic Rift was designed for a 1v1 situation where I get to keep all my stuff, you have to bounce all your stuff. That translated very well into the popularity of Commander, where it's like, oh, I still get to maintain this, but I get to interact with everybody at the same time because that's the way Overload works. It became one of the strongest cards in Commander. It still probably is one of the top 20 strongest cards in Commander, whatever those cards may be. I do not think it needs to be banned. There are so many times where Cyclonic Rift saves you from the person who's super far ahead. Just as many times where you get saved by a Cyclonic Rift as when you lose to a Cyclonic Rift. And I think people aren't putting enough appreciation into those times where Cyclonic Rift stops the person who's really far ahead, rather than the person really far ahead being the one with the Cyclonic Rift. All right, and this was all so that I could put this giant PSA out on the most hated card in Commander from my perspective, and the card that I absolutely 100% would ban if I could this day, Dockside Extortionist. The good old goblin that comes into the battlefield, makes a treasure for each artifact and enchantment your opponents control, not target opponent, but every single artifact and enchantment your opponents control collectively, you get a treasure for it, and it's a 2 mana card. I cannot stress this enough. This card is utterly broken. It is a huge design flaw, I think, to not put any sort of downside on this, to not lose life equal to the number of treasures or take damage equal to the number of treasures, to not have those treasures come in tapped, to not have to exile Dockside Extortionist when it leaves the battlefield. The fact that this is staple to an ETB is so offensive to me because it's so easy to loop this. I guess Recurrent Nightmare, I didn't really have an infinite combo in mind with Recurrent Nightmare. Boom, Dockside Extortionist, easy infinite combo, right? Just gives you the mana to recast things. I think Dockside Extortionist is a super hyper powerful card, and it does not make sense to me that something like Prophet of Crufix is banned, but Dockside Extortionist is not banned because Extortionist has the ability to end the game on the spot. Compare it to Brass's Bounty. Brass's Bounty is a 7-mana sorcery that makes a treasure for each land you control. It's often 7 mana to make something like 9 to 10 treasures. Dockside Extortionist does a very similar thing for 2 mana, and it's on an ETB on a creature that's easy to loop from the graveyard and replay over and over again. It enables infinites way too easily. It's a ritual type effect that easily puts you +8, +9, +10, sometimes even more mana on that. And the fact that it exists stifles people's creativity. I know I've said that a lot today, but I really do believe creativity in Commander is super important. I've seen people build these really cool decks. I've seen this new Johto legendary deck where people do these super cool things. They're going through their engines, and then they just play Dockside Extortionist, make a bunch of mana, and win. You know, they could have won with anything at that point. Dockside Extortionist, making 20 mana on ETB, just gives you the tools to win with whatever you want with no downside. And I think it'd be a lot cooler if those people took that card out of their deck and replaced it with something more thematic for their deck and, you know, tried a little harder to win, a little harder to generate mana. The card generates too much mana too easily and has no downside and is way too easy to loop. It is, in my opinion, the strongest card in Commander currently that's not on the ban list, and I think it needs to be banned. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I've seen so many games invalidated by the fact that someone just cast Dockside Extortionist early on, maybe even just later in the game, got way too much mana to keep up with, and just won the game. I think it's a net negative for the format that this card exists. I would be thrilled to see it banned. Okay, this is easily the longest episode of Scattered Thoughts thus far, but we talked about something like 45 cards and an additional 5 cards, so a lot to talk about here, a lot of opinions being thrown around. I think the hottest takes here are banning Dockside, unbanning Prophet of Krufix, maybe banning Drannith Magistrate and Thassa's Oracle. As always, I'm very interested in what people think. I know people have very strong opinions about stuff like this, and I know not everybody has their say in it. It's a very small group of people that determines what is and is not banned. If you agree or disagree with anything that's been said, let me know. I would love to have a conversation about this. Hit me up on Twitter at JankDiverGaming. I'll have some links down below where you can come find me, and we can have a little bit of a chat about it. Perfect time, too, since everybody's already talking about Drannith Magistrate, right? At any rate, we should probably bring this to a close. I've been talking forever. The voice is starting to go away. Thank you so much for being here if you're at this point. It's been really fun to talk about these. I've wanted to do this episode for a long time, but I also needed to categorize and, you know, lay out my own thoughts about these cards and have some hot takes for everybody. But anyway, that is the ban list for Commander. The cards that I think should be banned and unbanned, as well as the additional cards that are not on the ban list that I think might come and go. At any rate, thank you for watching. My name has been Timothy with Scattered Thoughts. This is episode number 7. Stay tuned. I'm going to try to put out one more episode of Scattered Thoughts before the new year as kind of a look back at 2022 and Magic, and I'm looking forward to doing that. Find me on social media at JankDiverGaming. Subscribe to this channel for more content like this, and let me know what kind of content you want to see, or if you have any topics that you would like me to go over. Thanks as always for watching. My name is Timothy with JankDiverGaming, and I will see you all next time.